Good morning. How we doing? Just making sure you're paying attention. I'm doing fine today. I'm just local here, Pasadena. Quick shot down here. Much harder week. Last week I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, the buckle on the Bible Belt, doing this very debate. It was pretty dicey, I got to tell you, being in the Deep South. I mean, people always wonder, are there ever incidences? There was an incident last week. I got right up in my face in the Q&A. I mean, we were kind of going back and forth like with an ump and a baseball player. And finally, I said unto him, "Go forth and multiply," but not in those words. You got to think about it for a second. Well, okay, so I'm going to go through 8 points in my 15 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, etc. here tonight to kind of cover the general and then specific comments that Douglas made. Point number one is that what we're trying to do here is an attempt to use natural arguments or explanations to prove something that ultimately I believe that you believe is supernatural, that is something outside of nature. So we're trying to use nature to prove something that is outside of nature, which is inherently, I think, contradictory. Actually, I should find out who is here, actually, when I say what you believe. How many of you believe in God here? Well, look at the time. I've really got to go. And how many of you would call yourself Christians? Yes, okay, all right. So I would say we have a slightly skewed audience compared to what we do at the Skeptics at Caltech. Anyway, so if God's existence is an empirical scientific question, how do we use the methods of natural science to prove something that is, well, inherently supernatural? So most of these kinds of arguments, these apologetic arguments, fall into the category of what we call God of the gaps arguments. They go something like this. X looks created. X can be anything, the fine-tunedness of the galaxies or the structure of cells, DNA, the eye, whatever you want to put X in. X looks created. 2, I can't think of how X was created naturally. I can't imagine how this could have come about naturally, say morality, for example. Therefore, X, morality or the cell or whatever, was created supernaturally. Okay? X looks created. I can't think of how it happened naturally, therefore it must have happened supernaturally. There's a similar problem like this that used to be argued but is no longer argued. At the end of Newton's great work, Principia Mathematica, he writes of what was called the problem of the plane. Why all the planets are in a single plane of the ecliptic, all going in the same direction, all spinning in the same direction, at least the ones they knew about then. And he could not figure out how this could have happened naturally using his theory of gravity and his mathematical equations and the calculus and so on. This just seemed way too complex, too fine-tuned and so on. He wouldn't use that language that we use today, but that's the argument. And he wrote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." This is the great Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists of all time. Why does nobody quote that anymore? And the answer is because that gap in our knowledge has now been filled. We know how solar systems are formed. And we know that the planets are in the plane of the ecliptic, except for Pluto, which is off, but it's not a planet anymore, so no problem. A condensing cloud of interstellar gas condensing from all directions. As it begins to condense, it begins to spin. As it begins to spin, it begins to flatten into a flat disk. Most of the matter in the center becomes a star or a binary star system. Little clumps of asymmetries as the gaseous cloud begins to collapse become planets and so on. We know how this happens. You can see it happening in other solar systems now. So we don't need to invoke God to explain the origin of solar systems anymore. The gap's been filled. No one bothers with that anymore. Same thing with the weather or climate or global climate change or global warming. No one invokes God to explain this incredibly complex system. This system is so complex that even in L.A., which is about as simple a weather system as you can get, the best that these guys can do is about 5 days out, and even then they're usually wrong. Why does nobody invoke a deity to explain this incredibly complex system, this fine-tuned, amazingly complex weather system. Because we have grown accustomed to natural explanations, and we have no need for the God hypothesis to explain that. So the problem with hooking your faith to particular current gaps in scientific knowledge is what's going to happen to your faith when the gaps are filled, as they inevitably are. If you take the long span of 400 years of the history of science, that's what happens. The gaps are filled. If I can make an analogy on this point, let's say we took one of these complex systems, DNA or the cell or something like that, and we found out that, in fact, it didn't evolve here on Earth through completely natural forces. There was some element of design to it. And let's say we discovered that the designer was an extraterrestrial intelligence who seeded Earth with complex cells, and then it evolved or whatever from there. This is a legitimate hypothesis. Sir Fred Hoyle, the great British astronomer, called this panspermia. The Earth was seeded with life from elsewhere. It never went anywhere because he had no evidence for it. But in any case, it was a legitimate theory for a while. Well, let's say it turns out that was right, and it was the Vegans from planet Vega, let's say, because I'm pretty sure there was a Star Trek episode about that, where the aliens all, by the way, parenthetically, aliens in Star Trek and Star Wars, they always look like bipedal primates with some gnarly stuff on their foreheads and speak English with an Indian accent. And it doesn't take a lot of biological knowledge to know that's not likely to happen somewhere on another planet. But let's say that turned out to be true. The Vegans planted life here on Earth. Well, this would be an incredible discovery. NASA would be elated. They would be able to go to NASA for more funding and so on. But it wouldn't explain the origins of life, a problem we're trying to solve now scientifically. It would just push it off one step. It would be, well, that's interesting. The Vegans did it. Wait a minute. How did they do it?